Disappearing is never clean. It is not a vanishing act, but a process. Slow, disorienting, almost tender. It begins long before anyone notices, before the trail goes cold or the search begins. It starts with a miscalibration of risk, a skipped signal, a delay, dismissed. The terror doesn't come from the storm or the silence. It comes later, in the recognition, in hindsight, when you look back at the concessions and compromises and realize the turning point is already behind you. When you realize these were critical and cascading errors that have taken you somewhere you cannot return from. And in the Valley of the Headless Men, it doesn't take more than one or two, one wrong assumption, one missed rendezvous, and you're already disappearing. Because that's what the Nahanni does. In 1960, 5 men set out with enough supplies to last the winter, and by the time the valley was done, only 2 would leave, and not a single one would return unchanged. They knew better than to stumble into the Nahanni. They prepared. Everything had been planned, mapped, and counted. They believed that what awaited them was hostile but manageable. The 5 men, each shaped by different lives, were drawn together by the same pursuit: hidden mineral wealth in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Johnny Richardson, 25, was a broke but determined Yellowknife local who made ends meet by minding sled dog teams and fishing. Married to Alice and father to a young son, he initially turned the expedition down because he had no stake money. When Alec Meiskonen offered to pay his way, Richardson sold one of his river shacks, left 3 months of food money for his family, and set out for the Nahanni. His plan was simple: trade dog handling and fishing skills for a shot at Nahanni placer gold. Alec Meiskonen, 57, was a Finnish Canadian bush veteran who had already fixed his passport and visas for a summer prospecting trip in South America. Longtime friend Dean Rossworn called him a quiet, well-read man who kept to himself. In September 1959, Meiskonen agreed to bankroll one more Nahanni gamble, chartered the flights, and paid Richardson's way. Orville Webb, 36, was a big-boned dog freighter and trapper who spent most winters cutting trails for mining outfits north of Great Slave Lake. Short on cash but long on optimism, he partnered with Pappas, freighted in a .303 carbine, 2 .22s, 200 rounds, and enough snares to blanket the bush. Tom Pappas, 41, was the wild card, a Greek Canadian who once skated right wing for the Montreal Maroons. He later ran a soft drink bottling plant in Yellowknife and funneled credit at the Bay. Dean Rossworn had drifted across Western Canada as a miner, bush laborer, and camp cook, carrying 173 pounds on a lanky frame before the trip. Known in Yellowknife as a hard-driving prospector, he joined the party to run Webb's dogs and test the creeks for coarse gold. In October 1959, the 5 men flew into the Nahanni. 3 of them flew in a few days ahead: Rossworn, Webb, and Pappas. By the time Richardson and Meiskonen arrived, the men were nearly finished building a cabin of spruce logs about 18 by 20 feet. They were targeting placer gold in the surrounding backcountry. The location was strategically chosen. It was remote enough to avoid competition, yet promising enough to justify overwintering. Along with sled dogs and rifles, they hauled in hundreds of pounds of food, flour, rice, dried goods, tinned meat. In the fall, they hunted local game and cached away caribou and geese in the snowpack. They prepared for months of isolation, packing in everything from stoves and fuel to dynamite. Richardson set out fish nets on the lake, looking to capture food for the dogs, but the only thing they caught in an entire week was 1 fish. 2 of the men with mining experience went to McLeod Creek to sink a shaft and determine if minerals were on site so they could stake a claim. The other 2 men set about to hunting, and after 4 days they shot a moose, but the meat was too gamey. Even the dogs only ate the tenderest pieces. They cut 20 miles of trail for a dog sled to reach a rumored fishing hole, but they still caught no fish. They changed their focus to begin hunting only. However, their prospecting licenses only allowed them to take 1 caribou each. Meanwhile, they continued prospecting, cutting maybe 40 miles of trail to Bennett Creek to sink another shaft. Early in January, several planes came into their camp, including one with a gaming warden. When he arrived, they had already broken the law by killing multiple caribou and caching the meat. They probably had close to 900 pounds, of which the warden ended up taking more than half. A few days later, he returned with an RCMP officer to detain one or more of the prospectors. The officer searched the camp and multiple trails for traps. They suspected the men were illegally trapping. When their search came up empty, the men returned to the plane, but not before packing up the remainder of the caribou meat. What remained for the prospectors was 3 weeks of flour, rice, tea, and coffee. Richardson begged them to radio for a resupply flight. The warden and officer said they would look into it. They loaded the confiscated meat and lifted away into the sky. The plane never came back. The cabin quickly became a biology experiment in vitamin deficiency. Gums bled, skin split. Rossworn's legs ballooned with edema, and he watched his weight drop from 173 to 122. Webb and Pappas took the 303 and spent days breaking trail through chest-deep snow, trying to flush out anything bigger than a squirrel. They returned empty-handed and frostburned day after day. Then their extraction date arrived, March 3rd. The float plane was scheduled to return. Wardaire's ledger showed the booking. The men in Yellowknife swore the party had paid in full, but sometime in December, over a few rounds of beer, an unnamed expediter canceled the charter. Wardaire chalked the flight up as a routine service trip, one that would only launch if the prospectors radioed a shopping list. The warden never passed along their message, and no one in Yellowknife bothered to ask why the valley stayed silent. So March 3rd came and went, while 5 men in the Headless Valley waited for an engine they would never hear. Initially, the 5 men believed the delay was due to weather, that the pilot had turned back due to rough skies, but for weeks, the sky stayed clear, and the ice stayed unbroken. Their food cache was thinning faster than expected. The snares yielded little, the meat stores were low, the fishing nets were empty. Even the sled dogs, once essential, began to shift in purpose from companions to compromises. It didn't happen all at once. That's not how these things go. It was a quiet disintegration. On March 15th, Richardson, Rossworn, and Pappas cut south toward Clark Lake, hoping the ice-free outlet might hold grayling. They carried tea, salt, 2 hooks, and faith. They found nothing but overflow. 2 days later, trudging back to camp, Richardson heard a blunt concussion roll across the valley. When he reached the cabin, Webb was on the ice, pale and babbling. He said Alec was gone. Richardson followed the boot prints to a spruce snag. Scattered in the snow were pieces of clothing, a smoldering fuse cord, and what was left of Alec Meiskonen. He had blown himself up with dynamite rather than face another day in the Headless Valley. By mid-April, Webb and Pappas made a call that felt inevitable. They would walk out. 110 miles of unmapped canyon lay between them and the Nahanni Butte. They packed half a pound of smoked meat in an old tobacco tin, 2 rifles, a blanket apiece, and a tarp. At dawn, they slipped through the trees and were gone. No trace of either man has ever been found. By late April, storms pinned Richardson and Rossworn inside for weeks. They ate a lynx, head and paws included, then dug up the frozen caribou hide they had buried in December, shaved off the hair, boiled it to glue, and drank the broth. On May 3rd, a ripple crossed the creek. Richardson snatched the 303, dropped a 30-pound beaver, 5 days of meat, maybe a week if they stretched it thin. Their salvation arrived on wings of accident. Bush pilots Chuck and Jim McAvoy, searching on a hunch, stirred up a worried outfitter, banked low over McMillan Lake, and spotted an SOS written in spruce boughs. What began as a calculated venture for mineral wealth ended as a case study in how quickly risk compounds in deep wilderness. A skipped resupply, a confiscated cache, a single misstep through river ice, little errors that in the Nahanni add up to one thing: disappearance. And that was it. 5 men entered the valley, and only 2 returned, changed forever.